This is just the beginning.
Welcome to New Shapers, America's Reckoning with Racial Inequality, a virtual event. I'm Elena Treen, congressional reporter for Axios, coming to you from Washington, D.C. Thank you to Bank of America for making this conversation possible on systemic racism in America today. And welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and #Axios Events. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll be joined by my colleagues Naila Boodoo and Russell Contreras. We will discuss how leaders in their respective fields are working to achieve equity, how institutions are reckoning with their histories, and what is being done to create lasting change. Our first guest today is South Carolina Congressman and House Majority Whip, Congressman James Clyburn, joining us from Washington, D.C. Congressman, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I guess I'll just jump right in. Three massive pieces of legislation in this space: our voting rights, police reform, gun legislation, and all three have stalled in Congress, despite Democrats controlling both chambers of Congress as well as the White House. I know that you've been integral to a lot of these negotiations. I'm curious, realistically, if you see a path forward, and if you do, how do we get there?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that the House of Representatives is, Democrats got a majority by 3, 4 today, but in 2 weeks it will be 3. And when it comes to the Senate, it's 50-50. And because the president, the vice president can break a tie, it means that we got a shot at the Senate. But we got to keep in mind, there are only 100 votes in the Senate, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. That means that you have to work very hard to get that other vote that you need to make it bipartisan. So I know that people say we control both, but that doesn't sound like real control to me. That simply means we got the authority to organize and can break a tie. So we're working it. I feel pretty good about where we are. We'll go home later this week, but I suspect we'll be back here in August. Though we are not scheduled to be back, we'll be back because I think that there's movement on all fronts. I don't know about guns, but I think when it comes to voting, there's some significant movement when it comes to voting. I think there's some significant movement when it comes to other issues as well, most especially what's going on with the infrastructure bills. I think that we're going to get there.
And as it relates to systemic racism, I think one question that I have is, what do you think some white people, particularly white journalists like myself, are missing about the discussion of systemic racism? Especially, it's more than a year now after George Floyd's murder, and we're in the midst of this debate over critical race theory. What do you think our roles, white people's role in this, should be?
Well, I think it's be clear to the American people. This whole issue on race and all this activity we see going on in elementary schools, all about critical race theory. Theory is the operative word. We do not teach theory in elementary school. We teach people in elementary school how to read, write, and how to be well-mannered, how to be respectful of others. Critical race theory is something at the university level. And for us to continue to apply that to these elementary schools and high schools, adding to that debate around the country, I think that that's what the media ought to do. Come clean with the American people and let them know this is a red herring. This is what people are trying to use in order to spread strife. And that's why we saw today this riveting testimony by 4 police officers who were there on January 6th, saying stuff totally opposite to what my Republican friends have been saying as to what was going on January 6th. And I just think that that's where we are missing the mark by not explaining to the American people, this is the truth. All the stuff that they're saying is just stuff that they're using to divide this country. Believe it or not, everybody sitting in office up here do not believe in democracy. These people believe in autocracy. There was one little line in today's testimony I think that people should pay attention to, and that was when one of those rioters said to the police officer, "You are on the wrong side of freedom." Think about that. You are on the wrong side of freedom. That's what they believe.
And so what work, particularly as it comes to, I don't think it's a question, as you are explaining, that politics plays a role in systemic racism and how we're messaging this. But how do you think that we cut through this and help making progress?
I think we do it by, once again, explaining to people what this is all about. I believe very much in capitalism. I believe that the corporate world really drives so much of the economic activity that take place in this country. And we ought to really play our role there and make sure that we do not allow the limiting of democracy that is taking place. That's why you see a lot of corporate people down in Georgia now stepping forth saying, we are not going to allow these laws that you've passed to define what Georgia is all about. And these laws, these repressive laws, these voter suppression laws are being proposed in 48 of our 50 states. Now, the question is, are we going to continue to be a democracy? Or are we going to go into an autocracy? Are we going to have nullification as being the law of the land? Back when Martin Luther King Jr. spoke here, or back in 1968, the question back then, of 63, the question back then was nullification. It is coming back and it's on steroids.
Mm-hmm. And I ask this, but I feel like a lot of the burden that we've seen through this conversation and of informing people has felt like it's been put on, minorities within Congress and minorities across the country. Is there more of a role that white people should be taking on themselves to help, end systemic racism?
All of us have roles to play. And I think that it's important for us to think about what we can contribute to the overall adventure that I call a democracy. Thomas Paine, back when this country was trying to give birth to itself, Thomas Paine wrote in his little pamphlet, The Crisis, that these are times that try men's souls. And summer soldiers and sunshine patriots will, in the crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands in now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. For tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Thomas Paine could have been writing that today. Summer soldiers, sunshine patriots, these people who love the country when everything is going well, especially for them. But the moment there are challenges, they can't bring their patriotism to bear. These summer soldiers who will fight as long as the weather is right. That's what's going on today. Thomas Paine's little crisis can be applied to where we are today. And if we fail to do today, as was done in 1776, this country could be lost and lost forever.
And really quick question for you as we approach the end here. Do you plan to run again in 2022? And if you do, will you still seek being majority whip, even if Speaker Pelosi doesn't run again?
Oh, I'm already running. I've been campaigning. Sure, I'm running. And if I get elected, I'll let my caucus decide what my future will be in the caucus. I have two sets of constituents. One, the members of the Democratic caucus here in the House. The other are the voters in the 6th Congressional District of South Carolina, and I will live by their verdict.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman. And next, we have A View from the Top, a segment with my colleague, co-founder and CEO of Axios, Jim Vandehei.
I'm Jim Vandehei, the CEO at Axios, and joining me for A View from the Top is the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch III, and Global Head of Environmental, Social, and Governance at Bank of America, Andrew Plepler. Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Lonnie, talk about the program. You have a new initiative at the Smithsonian that's focused on one of the epic topics of our time, certainly very relevant in the last couple of years, relevant and it's echoed forever. It's on race. Talk about it and talk about why the Smithsonian is taking this on.
Well, I think like everyone, we were devastated by the dual pandemics, the pandemic of racism, emphasized with the murder of George Floyd, the unfairness in terms of health access. So we thought, what can the Smithsonian do? At a time when a country is in crisis, we need to be there. And so the notion was that let's create an initiative with our great partner, Bank of America, that would allow us to look at our shared future through the lens of race. Because the Smithsonian has expertise in all aspects of race and ethnicity, that we thought it would be important for us to use our resources to create an opportunity for the American public to find, a true understanding of its past and yet to find hope. And so that's what we wanted to do, was to craft opportunities where people use the trusted brand of the Smithsonian to talk about issues, to better understand issues of race, and ultimately help us find that shared future.
And when you talk about reckoning with our racial past, what specifically do you think that the Smithsonian can bring to the table to further this conversation, one that's taking place in communities around the country, really around the world? What uniquely can the Smithsonian do?
Well, part of the challenge is that often people are already speaking to the already converted, right? That people who have different points of view rarely come together. Well, the Smithsonian is a trusted brand where people, a variety of political views, actually trust the Smithsonian, engage with issues at the Smithsonian. So what we want to do is use that trust to bring people together who normally don't engage. We want to use all the techniques we have to help people realize that there is a history to this. Understanding that history will understand how central race has been as a division, as an area of division in this country, but also how we can find those moments of hope where people have come together, cross racial lines, and basically move the country towards a more perfect union. That's what we want to happen with the Smithsonian.
Andrew, when most people are thinking of Bank of America, they're thinking of a bank, right? They're thinking of mortgages, they're thinking of savings accounts, they're thinking of investment advice. Why is Bank of America getting involved in this initiative, and why with the Smithsonian?
Well, we view it as an imperative to our role in society is to address some of the great challenges that we face as a country. And we think that a financial institution absolutely can be a partner in examining those challenges and in deploying resources to address those challenges. And there are no two greater challenges today, really, than climate and racial equality. And so when we focus on racial equality, one of the first partners we thought of is the Smithsonian. We were one of the early supporters of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it's in fact one of the first partnerships that I was fortunate enough to engage in when I got to Bank of America. And it's their perspective and knowledge of history and capacity to share that knowledge in a sober, calm, reasoned environment to educate people. And with perspective comes understanding. And that's what the goal of this initiative is.
In your portfolio at the bank, you deal with environmental issues, social issues, governance issues. So you have a wide portfolio of topics that you can choose from. What was the aha moment for the bank or for you personally in terms of taking on the racial reckoning, which a lot of people want to steer clear of because it can be very political and people tend to want to take the safe road. But you guys are plunging in to this topic at this time. Like, why? What was that aha moment?
Well, we had been examining the racial wealth gap in society for quite a while, prior to the murder of George Floyd and prior to the pandemic and the disparate impact that pandemic has had on minority communities. So all of this sort of came together, at that moment when the country began to reflect on the urgency of the moment. We had really already been shaping an initiative around economic opportunity and getting to the core elements of economic opportunity and addressing the racial wealth gap, but also understanding the role that history has played to get us to this moment. And we feel that we can't progress to the future without understanding the past. And that is why this partnership is so critical.
And Lonnie, when you think about this program and you think about it a couple of years from now, how are you going to measure success? By what measure will you say, yes, this did what we hoped to do? It facilitated the conversations. It spurred action. Like, what are the indicators you'll be looking at?
Well, I think first of all is an understanding how important it is to understand our history in its totality, right? To make sure that we are comfortable or at least understand the need to grapple with difficult moments of our past. But then what you want to have is through the variety of conversations we create, through the online work that we do, you have people who are using this platform to engage long after the moment. Because what was important for us was we wanted to respond to George Floyd. We also wanted to make sure that we had a program that would last for many years, that would give people the opportunity, because it's going to be a long challenge to grapple with fundamental issues of race. We think with this project, with the support of Bank of America, we'll find an opportunity for people to dip into a reservoir of candor and a reservoir of understanding.
As we wrap up, Andrew, take a crack at that same question from Bank of America's perspective. How will you measure success? You're a big company. You probably have metrics for almost everything you do. What's the big metric you'll look at?
We'll look at the number of people that have been exposed to this initiative, because we think that this is a sober conversation about the vital role that race has played in our history as a nation, both moments of great progress and moments of enormous challenges. And we think now more than ever, it's important that people understand that and have a fact-based conversation to celebrate our country, but also to realize that we have real challenges. And the more people we can get exposed to that kind of fact-based education, we think will be vitally important as our nation grapples with these very real challenges.
Thank you guys both for this conversation. Thank you to Lonnie and the work you do at the Smithsonian. Anyone who's visiting D.C. has a chance to see any of the museums and the sort of the crown jewels of what D.C. has to offer. You find it the Smithsonian. And thank you to Bank of America and to you, Andrew, for making this broader conversation possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now over to my colleague, Naila Boodoo.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Naila Boodoo, and I'm the host of the Axios Today podcast. Our next guest is author of the book, Ida B. the Queen. She's also the great-granddaughter of the civil rights icon, Ida B. Wells, Michelle Juster, joining us from Chicago, Illinois. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Naila. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for being here with us. Michelle, I wanted to start by talking about the monument. You worked on a monument for more than a dozen years, and it was just unveiled about a month ago to your great grandmother, Chicago's first monument dedicated to a Black woman, which is so fitting for all of her trailblazing. I remember we have talked to you about this years ago. You've been working on this for so long. How did it feel when you watched it finally being unveiled at the end of June?
Oh, I mean, it was just amazing. Richard Hunt was the sculptor who created the monument, which is abstract and interpretive, but it includes a couple of panels, 3 panels on the base of it, so people can see images of it and read some quotes in the biography. So it's a little different than what I think most people think of as a statue. It is a monument, and it's very. It has a very powerful kind of presence, which I think is indicative of who Ida was and the way Richard Hunt interpreted her.
What did you have to do to get this monument created? I think a lot of people think about this or maybe just see them and don't think about all the work that goes into this. And in your case, the more than a dozen years you spent trying to get this to happen.
Right. Working on these projects is actually quite complicated. You have to have a spot, a place to create the monument. You have to work with artists. There's a budget, and in this case, it took a while to raise the money for the monument. I worked with a committee to get this created. There were various ways that we fundraised for the monument. And then you have to deal with community leaders and politicians, and there's just a lot of different stakeholders that you have to sort of coordinate with in order to make these things happen.
So for the money part of this, I know after 7 years you raised about $100,000, and then in 4 months you were able to raise the other $200,000, and it was mostly on Twitter, right?
Yes, it was pretty much all on Twitter. In 2018, we had been raising the money for about 7 years. And I basically just decided, we have to think outside of the box here, because there were a lot of restrictions on how we could raise the money. And so I just decided to do something different and go on social media and try to lift up the project to a national level versus a local level. And I started tweeting about the project and tagging people. I was very strategic about who I tagged so that it could get national attention. And that's what ultimately happened, and we got national support.
I wonder how much you think conversations around Confederate statues and those being removed raised awareness and helped what you were trying to do.
I think there were several factors that happened around the same time. Obviously, the controversies regarding Confederate statues and how do we as a country tell our history in public spaces was a conversation. There also was a person in the White House who was very sort of hostile toward reporters and journalists in general. And so I think within the journalism community, there was a heightened appreciation for who Ida was and what she did as a journalist. And then there was the centennial of the 19th Amendment in 2020. So there was also, more awareness of the struggle for the right to vote and the fact that Ida was involved in the suffrage movement. So there were several factors that all converged around the same time that I think made her story more relevant and more interesting, and people were really kind of studying her, the work in those 3 different areas.
And there are so many extraordinary aspects to her life. Born into slavery, growing up during Reconstruction. How did growing up during that time shape who she became?
Oh, I think it shaped her greatly. I mean, my great-grandmother came of age during Reconstruction. She was born into slavery in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. But the fact that she grew up during Reconstruction is very significant because she had the opportunity to become formally educated. She was a firsthand witness to African American men having the right to vote as a result of the 15th Amendment. And so she saw her father vote, and she grew up in a politically active family. And so she saw her father also become an entrepreneur as a carpenter. And she was surrounded in this environment of people taking advantage of all of these newfound rights. And so, that's very significant as far as what she thought was possible that she could achieve in her life.
And when you think of all of the things that she did accomplish, she ran for elected office, she was a teacher, she was a social worker, one of the founders of the NAACP. I wanted to ask you how she used investigative journalism, though, as a way to fight injustice.
She absolutely used journalism as a form of activism, because what happened was that, what sparked her activism was two things. One was she had an incident with the train where she was asked to leave the ladies' car and move to the smoking car, or the colored car that doubled as a smoking car. And she was insulted by that, and she wrote about the situation in the newspaper. She ultimately sued the railroad, initially won, but then eventually the ruling was overturned. So that sparked her activism, and that was in the 1880s. And then 1892, three of her friends who were enterprising businessmen were killed, basically for being successful because they rivaled a white-owned store. And so these two incidents were very significant in making my great-grandmother realize that Black people really could not get justice. And in fact, if you decided to sort of push the boundaries and try to fight for first-class citizenship, then there was a pushback and ultimately violence. And so she exposed this reality that lynching was being used as a form of domestic terrorism, instead of as a punishment for what the crime at the time that people were being charged with was, or accused of, was violating white women. And she knew that was not true. And so she exposed that truth through her journalism, and she started investigating other lynchings and found time and time again that was not a crime that had been committed, but it was a form of oppression and terror that was being used against the Black community.
The Chicago Monument is actually called the Light of the Truth, based on that famous quote of hers. Are those her words that also resonate the most with you?
I mean, there are a lot of words of hers that resonate with me, but that definitely is one of them. The quote is, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And I mean, I think it's true. I mean, you have to tell the truth in order to make change. You have to admit that there's a problem before you can solve it. And she was using journalism as a way to shed light on the truth. And she was using the truth as a weapon, really, against these false narratives that were being used to justify this type of violence that was being inflicted on the Black community. And she truly believed that the truth would lead to justice.
Michelle Duster, great-granddaughter of the civil rights icon Ida B. Wells, and most recently the author of Ida B. the Queen. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Nyla.
And now to my colleague, Russell Contreras.
Thanks, Nyla. I'm Russell Contreras, the race and justice reporter for Axios. Our final guest is activist and scholar Rosa Clemente. She's also the president and founder of Know Thyself Productions, and she is joining us from Albany, New York. Rosa, it is a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today.
Russell, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Before we get started in your work, right after the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, there was this self-reflection among Latinos, mainly Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, about our relationship with Black communities, but also our relationship with our anti-Blackness throughout our history. What is going on and what took us so long to have this conversation?
Well, historically, African American, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, and other parts of what we know to be Latin America, including the Caribbean. Here in the United States, we've always been in social justice movements together. I think it's a historical inaccuracy for anybody to say, it took George Floyd for Latinos to have what is called racial consciousness, especially amongst Puerto Ricans, but also that Blackness, as I do my work around Afro-Latinx, Black Latinx identity, Blackness as racial Blackness is talked in terms in this country of a specific ethnic group, African Americans, because that when we use that as our starting point on how we even address race, we're already flawed because that discounts Black Puerto Ricans, Black Dominicans, Black Panamanians, Cubans, Brazilians. Brazil has the largest African descendant population outside of the continent of Africa compared to the rest of the world. So no, I mean, I've been in movement for 30 years and I've been in movement with what I call Black folks of other throughout the diaspora. Is anti-Blackness something that is real? 100%. But again, in my work, I argue that the Western empire and the rest of this world is anti-Black because wherever Black people are, including Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, Black people are not seen as full human beings. Except here in this United States, Black people have never been given the rights of full citizenship in this country. So I come from a social justice perspective and movement and Black studies perspective that has allowed me to learn that we've always been in solidarity with each other. And at the same time, we are fighting anti-Blackness, especially those like me who call themselves a Black Puerto Rican. I'm not Black and Puerto Rican, I'm a Black Puerto Rican.
Of course, this is bringing up conversations about allyship and people wanting to see a kinship and allyship with people from the diaspora. What are some things that allies should do and what are some things they should not when competing for this space for social justice?
Yeah, so for me, I don't consider other people of color allies. I consider them part of my community. The word allyship, very academic, higher ed, in the nonprofit kind of philanthropic world, was referring to particularly white Americans, right? When Black Lives Matter started, that's when you start to see this word allyship. But for me, again, as an academic in Black studies, I reject allyship in that way because we don't need particularly white people to feel our pain or be our allies. We need them to be accomplices for racial justice. That includes not having to ask a person of color a question that you can figure out on your own, all the way to not always having to come into our communities, but really doing the work in the larger white community. So, and history, again, particularly the history of the 60s, post-civil rights movement, when we get into the Black power, brown power era of this country, you begin to see white radicals, particularly the Weather Underground, who used targeted bombings to get their point across. People would say that's crazy. That in that day was what was happening. That generation of young people, including white radical, white anti-imperialists, really thought a revolution was around the corner. And to this day, those are the people that I think are the white radicals who literally have put their bodies in the line, have died for Black freedom. And some of them, like David Gilbert, have been incarcerated for almost 50 years for fighting within this time frame of Black power. So I tell young white folks, I don't need an ally. I need you to be an accomplice for justice. I need you to dedicate your life to upending white supremacy and white privilege, not when it's trendy, not when it's easy, but at the times that it is hardest for a white person to do that, that is the time they should be doing that work.
The Black Puerto Rican journalist Jesus Calon was just nominated and inducted into the Hall of Fame for the National Association for Hispanic Journalists. We recently had a book on the Young Lords Party, which talks about Black Latinos in the movement of the 1960s. But yet we're still marginalizing Black Latino history. Why is it taking us so long to embrace this legacy and have these conversations?
Well, what we're facing now, right, in general, is a right-wing attack against intellectualism, against studying, against reading. We have a lot of people out here that think that they're political and have no historical grounding, or use our history of shared struggle to make sure that we don't come together again in that way. The first tenet of white supremacy is to literally divide and conquer other people, particularly other people of color. But what it comes down to, Russell, is until the United States apologizes and gives land back to the Native American indigenous people of the country, the First Nations, until African Americans, not Black Latinos, African Americans, until they get reparations, this country has not had any accountability or have had any to have restorative justice or truth and reconciliation. So until that happens, these incidences are going to continue to rise. And right now, what we're seeing is a very coordinated, soon to be attack, in my opinion, very coordinated. History will show that when we're in this road and kind of here with fascism, but more white violence and white identity extremists, right? They're coming after us. And part of the reason is because in the next 20 years, we as people of color will be the majority in this country. And they know that. And if they don't know it, somebody's telling them to fear us, that we're the problem, immigrants are the problem, that women of color are the problem, when really without us, this country would not work. And the best way anybody could really see that clearly is who was working when the pandemic was at the astronomical levels that it was at. Black and brown people. That's who was delivering the food. That's people like my husband who were in COVID dorms cleaning up after young, mostly rich white kids, people working in the hospitals. We as Black and brown people have died disproportionate to the number of people here. So I think it's important that people look at this pandemic because it has shown and shine a light on all the systemic, right, injustices that are happening. The flip side of that is, as organizers, we organize anytime we can, in any given opportunity. That's our job as organizers.
In our final 30 seconds left, can you tell us what we need to keep in mind when we're seeing the protest in Cuba, that we include Black voices and we don't just marginalize those people who are speaking out?
Yeah, I mean, Cuba has two stories in the United States. Either you believe everything is horrible in a fascist communist dictatorship, or you look at it as a place where the Cuban forces fought on the side of the South Africans, that Cuban medical advances have been faster than any country, and they have the lowest literacy rate. That being said, it doesn't mean that what we're not seeing is not happening. Particularly Afro-Cubans are being attacked. A younger population is increasingly Afro-Cuban. So I tell people, when you're going on these social media feeds, make sure you listen to the voices of Afro-Cubans, because their experience as, quote, Latinx people is very different. All of us have different experiences. So listen to the voices on the ground that are getting their messages out as what looks to be a youth revolution happening right now in Cuba.
Rosa, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And thank all of you for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. And thank you to our sponsor, Bank of America, for making this event possible. For more information or to sign up for our Axios AM, our sneak peek newsletters, visit axios.com/newsletters or go to our Axios app. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you on axios.com.